Yes.
Goedemiddag.
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 Alweer.
Hey, hallo.
Goedemiddag.
Middag.
Zo van, ja, het was net een avondje geleden.
Ja.
Ja, hoi Kees. Hallo.
Hallo. Ik weet niet, Titja, hoe het met jullie is, maar ik zie de presentatie van Somo
Ja.
nog steeds.
Maybe we can stop that.
Alejandro,
Alejandro.
could you switch off?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
that's better.
Ja. 25 deelnemers. Nou, dat is mooi.
27.
27 zelfs. Kan je nagaan. Het gaat vanzelf harder.
Nou, ik ga ervan uit dat er nog wel een paar bij zullen komen.
Ja.
Yeah. Mostly it's about 50, 60.
Yes.
We zouden een muziekje moeten hebben, hè?
Kunnen deelnemers zichzelf muten als de introductie begint? Anders moeten Titia en ik dat doen.
Maar ze doen het haast allemaal. Ik ben bezig. I think you can start.
Ja? Shall I start? Welkom, dames en heren. En de voertaal is Engels. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the 5th seminar in a series with the overall title Energy Transition in Europe and Africa. How can this be an equal partnership? In the previous 4 webinars, we discussed a Dutch policy recommendation for the necessity of a just global energy transition. The second webinar was about the dilemma of centralized versus decentralized access to electricity in Africa. The third on the possible contribution of hydrogen production in African countries to their development goals. And the fourth, an African perspective on their own energy transition. Ahead of us are 2 more webinars. One is on the Draghi report and the consequences, the conflicts or the synergy with the energy transition in Africa. And the last is a wrap-up of all the political recommendations from all the webinars. The dates of these 2 webinars still to be decided. And now we are in the 5th webinar with the title Critical Minerals, the Battery-paradox. And the battery in the title is an example of an essential technology in the energy transition. The topic is urgent, controversial, and very geopolitical. If we just read the newspapers, we see that China has developed a near monopoly on critical minerals and the products of critical minerals, and is now starting to weaponize the export of these materials as a reaction to the threat by Mr. Trump of setting tariffs to the imports from China. Trump as well is threatening to confiscate Greenland because of critical minerals, and is demanding from the Ukraine that it repays its debt for the war loans via critical minerals. Congo is suing Apple for the illegal appropriation of its minerals via its subsidiaries. Rebels, with the aid of Rwanda, are occupying parts of mineral-rich Congo and financing this rebellion with these minerals. And as a consequence, the EU is now under pressure to freeze its deal with Rwanda on critical minerals, a deal that the EU developed in last year. At the same time, the flagship EU battery factory, Northvolt in Sweden, went bankrupt, or nearly so. France is being shown the door by its former colonies. The Netherlands is trying to limit its development aid, and Mr. Trump again is trying to get rid of development aid completely. So it is a very controversial and very geopolitical subject. We are very happy, therefore, that we have found two distinguished speakers who agreed to introduce us to this topic. This is Alejandro González from SOMO, de Stichting Onderzoek Multinationale Ondernemingen, and Benjamin Sprecher, Assistant Professor of the TU Delft on Industrial Design Engineering. We have asked the two speakers two leading questions. The first is, what should you, as a politician or as an interested member of the public, know about critical minerals before you formulate an opinion? And two, what could be an equal partnership with mineral-rich African countries? How could it look like? And we've asked the speakers to finish their presentations off with some recommendations for politicians in the EU or perhaps in the Netherlands, and perhaps also recommendations for governments of mineral-rich African countries. The presentations will be approximately 20 minutes. Alejandro will start, followed by Benjamin, and then we hope that we have approximately 20-30 minutes left for discussion. The discussion will start first by asking the speakers to react to the presentation of the other speaker, because perhaps there will be points of disagreement or points of agreement, and it's very interesting to these. Followed then by discussion points from the organizer of the webinar series and from the chat. So please feel free to use the chat box, which will be monitored for pertinent questions and discussion points. Last but not least, turn the microphones off, but I think that has already been done by everybody. I look at the speakers, at the moderators. Is this enough to start off the first presentation? Okay. Alejandro, the floor is yours. Your volume. Your volume.
Yes, sorry. Thank you and welcome everyone. My microphone, I just made aware that it's not so good, but I tried to speak loud. Let me know if you have problems following. My name is Alejandro González, and I am a senior researcher with SOMO, with the Climate Justice team. I will share my screen now. So at SOMO, we follow closely the minerals space and also EU regulations and also EU partnerships with third countries. I will say that the first thing we need to know, and many of you, I'm sure you already know, but is that the EU is heavily dependent on minerals that are produced elsewhere. For example, when you see at key value chains, for example, batteries or robotics or solar panels or wind farm, the EU produces only 1 or 2% of those raw materials. And also the processing of those materials is also dominated by other countries. In many cases, the processing is dominated by China. So here is an example of some of the key minerals that are used for the energy transition, but also for the digital and electronics, and also for defense. And for example, we see that production tends to be dominated in a few countries. For example, copper is the production is concentrated in the DRC, in Congo, in Chile and Peru. Nickel is dominated by Indonesia, and cobalt is dominated by DRC. And when it comes to the refining and the processing, there really you see how China dominates the processing of these minerals. So it's highly concentrated. And we also see that there is going to be a skyrocketing mineral demand for the EU, right, for strategic sectors. But I think it's also important to know that we often hear that we will need vast amounts of minerals, but actually the production of electric vehicles accounts for a big part of that demand. So even like 50 or 60%. And for some minerals, even almost 90% of the demand is for electric vehicles. So we need to be aware that it's not to put everything on the same basket, right? And electric vehicles is not the same as solar panels or wind. It's also a way of thinking like what is driving this demand, and the electric vehicles, which also big cars are pushing for this demand. So this is something to take into account. And of course, to produce these minerals, there is a huge impact, right? One thing is the demand of minerals, but the other thing is how much waste and how much ore needs to be removed and processed to process those minerals, right? For example, in a recent study by the US Geological Survey, in order to produce 1 ton of nickel, 250 tons of ore and waste rock need to be processed. So, or to produce 1 ton of copper, then 500 tons of ore and waste need to be required. So this is, of course, having a profound impact on the environment. And to make things worse, under the current transition, despite the introduction of electric vehicles, the global fleet of cars continue to grow. So, and many of these minerals are exposed to high environmental risks. The projects are located in areas with water stress and earthquake risk, with high geopolitical risks. Also, today refining occurs in places with high carbon intensity of the grid. So mostly in regions relying on coal-based electricity to mine these minerals that are supposedly for the energy transition. Places like South Africa or Indonesia that rely on coal. So this is also something to take into account, and also that the mining industry is dominated by a few major companies, which are all yielding small and often oligopolistic markets. So that's from the perspective of the minerals. Now, I think that from the perspective of the EU, it's also important to take into account that since colonial times, Europe has built wealth by importing cheap raw materials and exporting high-value finished goods. And such trade relations have become the basis for many structural economic deficiencies in the global economy, with many countries in the global south remaining locked at the bottom of the value chain due to their excessive reliance on extractive industries and low-value uh, manufacturing. So the global economic architecture extracts uh, trillions of financial flows from the global south to the global north. And the EU and the Dutch renew focus on domestic green growth and consequent pursuit of critical minerals in the context of the green transition is risking to perpetuate these dynamics of dependency and unequal development. So I think this is also very important to take into account. Also, how the value is distributed along the value chain is very unequal. For example, this is the value distribution in the battery value chain, and you see how the mining of nickel, lithium, and cobalt accounts for only 0.6% of the total value of the battery. And this only increases to 1.1 when the smelting and refining of minerals concentrates into industrial grade metals are considered. So the biggest value is at the other end of the chain in the battery and EV production, which, as I mentioned, is dominated by a few multinational corporations. So this begs the question, is this a just transition? The scramble for minerals is exacerbating environmental impacts. The way in which the West and China are approaching the energy and the transport transition is also deepening global inequalities. The quest for minerals and metals by the wealthy countries is reinforcing a pre-existing neocolonial economic framework where resource-rich countries are pushed to remain as suppliers of raw materials that feed the consumer demands and the unsustainable lifestyles of global powers. And many of the countries that are at the source of those minerals do not have access to the technology that the minerals are used. And many countries lack the infrastructure and revenues to make the transition. I think we need to take all of this into account to have an informed opinion. Though all of this is to answer question one, that China and the West are supporting their multinational companies with taxpayers' money in the form of subsidies and tax breaks. And such policies are reinforcing the dominance of Western and Chinese corporate giants. And the trend towards concentration of power in a relatively small number of companies. Companies are converting public money into private profit and into creating more shareholder value. And those same companies frequently externalize the negative impacts of extraction. And now passing to question two, so what can we do about this, taking this into account, right? So how do we achieve an equitable use of minerals? That was question number two, right? And for this, we also need to talk a little bit about context, like the world is facing a planetary crisis or multiple crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And all of these crises are driven by one major factor, which is the increased extraction and processing of resources. In this report of last year, the UN International Resource Panel reported that the current model of using resources to deliver economic growth is causing the crisis. And in addition to this, we need to take into account the inequality crisis, right? High-income countries consume 6 times more materials per capita than low-income countries, and such consumption is well above planetary boundaries and what is needed for well-being. So we need to think about this when we talk about equitable use of resources. Also, high-income countries are also responsible for 10 times more climate impacts than low-income countries. And through global trade, high-income countries shift the environmental impacts to other income country groups, often with minimum added value. For example, in 2022, Africa and Latin America experienced over 50% of global land biodiversity loss, but generated less than 10% of the global resource value added. In contrast, Europe and North America capture nearly 50% of this value, while facing less than 10% of global water stress and biodiversity loss. So we cannot talk about the energy transition or about equality without talking about inequality. So the climate crisis is deeply linked to inequality, both between countries and within countries. So for the transition to be just and for any standard or initiative to be sustainable, we must address the unsustainable resource use, especially of the affluent countries, right? So this means a drastic reduction of resource consumption in the global north and a fairer distribution of benefits. This is the work of the System Transformation Hub, where they are calling for deeply reforming the socio-economic system, like systemic changes, which is also what the IPCC report is calling for, like structural changes. The current system where natural resources are exploited for economic activities is the root of many global issues. So a shift is needed towards a more holistic view of prosperity beyond extraction and production. So we can also look at the provisioning systems, of which are the systems that um, for example, it's about mobility, about housing, about energy. Though we need to be talking about the needs and what are the needs that we need to be satisfying. It's not necessarily that we need an electric car, right? What we need is mobility. For example, so we need to be looking into how to maximize the economy ability to meet human needs while respecting planetary boundaries. So also prosperity indicators beyond GDP are essential, incorporating resource efficiency, demand side approaches, decarbonization and dematerialization. Shifting to sustainable mobility involves more than electrifying cars, but also it's about creating an accessible, affordable, and integrated transport system, public transportation. There is also some calls to new indicators of progress, such as beyond growth metrics like science-based targets, and also crucially, material targets, right? Reducing the EU material footprint by 50% by 2030 can support efforts to dematerialize and increase prosperity. And then, of course, the circular economy, right? But when we talk about circular economy, usually people think of recycling first, but recycling is at the end. First, you need to design products that are smaller, that last for longer, that are, and also if the demand keeps growing, then recycle will never play a significant role. So first, we need to reduce the demand. And of course, recycling is important, but there's much more to circular economy than recycling. And then when it comes to the partnerships with producing countries or resource-rich countries, actually the work on the UN Secretary General panel on critical energy transition is relevant here. There's some recommendations there on benefit sharing, value addition, and economic diversification, and also on responsible and fair trade, investment, finance, and taxation. That is a actionable recommendation number one. And we have been working on how to implement these recommendations. For decades, trade liberalization has been presented as a pathway to growth and development. However, in practice, it has favored the most competitive industries that are typically concentrated in the EU and other advanced economies. So meanwhile, many African countries remain locked into an unequal trade relationship where they are compelled to export raw and unprocessed materials while importing high-value technology advanced goods. This dynamic is stifling industrial development and also deepening economic dependency. And the green transition is risking reinforcing this pattern. So many of the African countries are reaching critical minerals, but without a policy intervention, they will continue to be mere suppliers of raw materials while being forced to import the very technologies that they are built with their resources. So this imbalance can exacerbate fiscal pressures, increase debt vulnerabilities, and many African countries are already struggling with constrained fiscal space. Meanwhile, the European industries benefit from strong state support, giving them an even greater competitive advantage in global markets. So we actually published recently a paper together with civil society organizations and government representatives and UNCTAD and UNEP on policy recommendations for because as part of this UN panel, a high-level advisory group will be created. So we dive there deep into what is a fair share of benefits from mining and how to distribute them equitably. How can we talk about value addition, diversify economy, and trade finance and investment? There is so I will reference the audience to this report. But in a summary, what we need are concrete measures like technology transfer, investments in green industrialization, and policy space for countries to implement industrial policies that serve their development needs. Debt restructuring is also essential. Without it, African governments will remain trapped in a position where they must extract and export resources simply to meet debt repayments and rather than invest in long-term development. And at the WTO, the African group has consistently pushed for greater policy space to support industrial development, yet these calls have been met with resistance, particularly from the EU and the US, which continue to block proposals that would allow African nations to implement the kind of policy that Europe itself has historically used to build these industries. So also on ISDS, EU member states hold numerous trade agreements with African countries and bilateral investment treaties where they also impose these agreements often include ICS mechanisms which allow corporations to sue governments over policies that might affect their expected profit. So this has been a major concern for many African nations, leading to the termination of treaties with the Netherlands by countries, for example, South Africa, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, and Kenya. And these countries understand that restrictive investment treaties can limit their ability to regulate, promote domestic industry, and protect public interest. So in this paper, we offer concrete recommendation on how to respect the national policy space for producing countries and for them to advance value addition and domestic industrialization. Also calling for reforms to the international trade and investment frameworks. Technology transfer is encouraged rather than prevented. And also how international trade and investment frameworks can include binding environmental, social, and accountability safeguards and due diligence in the specific projects that support. So I think I will stop my first part of the presentation there, 20 minutes, and maybe looking forward to having an open discussion later on. So thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. You have very well maintained your time slot. Perhaps it's good to have a certain breather. Just let's first 1 minute try to settle it down. Not talk about it, but just everybody has the time to sort of think about what we have heard. And after 1 minute, give the floor to Benjamin. It's a meditative moment, maybe.
Yeah, it was a lot. Sorry, I didn't know it was 20 minutes, so I had to put a lot into.
Very well.
I'm sorry if I gave too much information.
No, it's okay. And I think your presentation will be shared, no, teacher?
Yes, for sure.
Well, perhaps Benjamin, you can warm up and start your presentation.
Share my screen. Yeah, I should apologize. Also, I just had the flu for a week and a half, so I might be coughing a little bit. Try to do that as little as possible. Let's see. Share. Okay, do I have a full screen
No.
sharing?
Yeah.
jaaropgave naar jou gestuurd. Dat goed
Yeah.
is. Ik zag iets verschijnen. Moet je even kijken, maar die tweede,
Maybe
dan zou
also
ik van alle
someone
jaren dat ik gewerkt heb sturen.
should be muted.
Someone is talking. I don't know who it is.
Well,
Okay.
okay, sounds good. So, thank you very much for your attention. I will. So I'm Benjamin Sprecher, assistant professor at Delft University at the Faculty of Industrial Design, and I am specialized in critical raw materials. Did my PhD on it a long time ago, before it was a topic of interest to most people. And I'll just briefly go through what I think are some interesting points, and I'll skip the things that Asan already said. But let's go back into the past. Executive order on addressing the threat to the domestic supply chain from reliance on critical raw materials from foreign adversaries. So this is a Donald Trump national emergency that he declared in 2020, just to kind of show like this is not a new topic, especially in the United States already. It's been a topic of interest for a long time, and then Biden came and he kind of also kept the pressure on this topic. And then just today, we have this nice headline: Trump loosens enforcement of US law banning bribery of foreign officials. Okay, that's in all the insanity that Trump has been doing. I thought this was a nice one to highlight, because if you look at the bottom, companies related to this news tidbit is Glencore. And Glencore is one of the major European mining companies, Swiss mining company, well known for doing a lot of bribery in the past. So I thought also this is a nice moment for me to finally come clear and tell this little anecdote. I also go visit these mines every now and then. So then I went to this in Africa, in way up northern Uganda, the border with Kenya and South Sudan. And then this beautiful gentleman on top with the big machine gun. I had to pay him $10 to be allowed to go past him. So tiny bit of bribery in order to get to these areas. But then if you go to these areas, I think it's really important as an academic to not just sit in the Netherlands in your ivory tower, but also go to these areas and really experience how it is and how people live there and what they think and how they talk about us. So it was really illuminating to ask them what they think that we should be doing. Okay, so then Asana already mentioned a lot of the background, but I thought it's also really interesting as a true academic to go into definitions, critical raw materials, what makes something a critical raw material, and I went all the way back to the original picture drawn by Professor Tom Gradle a while back, and you see here the theoretical definition. When something is critical, it's when there's a risk to the supply. So you can there's a risk that you cannot have it if you need it. That's the vulnerability to supply restrictions. Then the supply risk, that's how big of a problem is it if you don't get it. Right? So some materials you cannot get, like promethium, but yeah, you don't need it, so it doesn't matter. Some materials like copper, you really need it, so if you don't get it, you have a big problem. And then the third axis is environmental implications. So in the scientific definition of criticality, we used to say, so if it's an economic problem, that's bad, but also needs to have some kind of environmental problem. So some metals are much more damaging to the environment to mine than others. But of course, if you look at the EU criticality list, here you can see it turned into a two-axis picture. So you have supply risk on one side and economic importance on the other side. No more environmental implications, no more social implications that fell by the wayside, as you can probably imagine. But I just thought it was interesting to kind of go back in history and say, we tried as scientists, we try to keep the environmental aspect top of mind. So what happens if these materials become under pressure? So you get a lot of these random things like Trump saying he wants to buy or invade Greenland, okay? But also what you get is a lot of these supply like disruptions, and that turns into price peaks. So here are just some random graphs of big peaks in the supply in the price. So price stays steady, something happens, bam, price goes up 5 times, 10 times. And that's basically the real world effect. It's not that you cannot get it usually, but you're paying way more for it. And then we talk about fairness. So before we go into some, numbers, I thought interesting. Maybe I normally, if this were a not online thing, I would do some show of hands. And here, I think it's a bit complicated. So I'm just going to ask Alejandro, I would ask you, what do you think in terms of fairness? What is actually fair? How much is the Netherlands? How much rights do we have, between brackets, to all the metals being produced in the world? So should be by GDP. So we kind of are allowed to use 1% of the world's metals for ourselves for energy transition, or it's for the energy transition, so it goes by 0.5%, or maybe we go by population, so we have 0.2% of all the metals we can use for electric cars and wind turbines and such. What do you think is fair?
Yeah, I wouldn't think of a percentage, but I will think more of operating within a safe space for the environment. So operating within the planetary boundaries, and also so that the basic needs are satisfied, but also without exceeding planetary boundaries, right? So more like a safe operating space.
So if I translate this to scientific terms, you would say, okay, there's a carbon budget, there's a tons of carbon emitted per ton of metal produced, and then as a fraction of the total carbon budget, then that's the amount of metals that we can use. And then I guess that goes to GDP, because GDP is the most strongly correlated to carbon. Okay, very good answer. I like it.
Just to say that not only look into carbon, right? That's because that tends to be an issue that everyone is thinking about carbon emissions, which is important, but there's many other planetary boundaries like biodiversity or ocean acidification and so on.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, this is all true. Okay, good. So planetary boundaries. Very good answer. Actually, I never heard it before, but it does make a lot of sense. Well, if we then go look at the Netherlands, so this was some numbers that we made a couple of years ago. Just to show if we do what the Dutch government was planning, I'm not sure about the current Dutch government, but the previous Dutch government, the plans that they had for the energy transition, and then you translate that into the amount of stuff that we need in the Netherlands as a percentage of the total global production, right? So you can see some of them you need like 25% of the total global production of iridium. That's quite a lot. For some of them, it's more like 15%, 10%. And then you go to the more base metals. You get, okay, it's still 5%, 1 to 3% of the total world production of these metals for just the energy transition. So basically, we need a lot of metals, and it's also quite out of, if you go back to this graph, whichever option you choose, and definitely if you choose safe operating space, because we exceeded that already by far, then you see that the energy transition requires a lot more metals than is kind of fair in any of these scenarios. But I think also really important to keep in mind, people forget or aren't aware of quite often, that there's also a other side of the coin, which I think is good to highlight, is that the energy transition leads to less kind of mining in general. So here you see, if you do this energy transition for electricity, you see that the blue thing is the amount of mining that we do for metals, and that goes up. But the fossil fuel mining goes down a lot, just simply for the fact that if you mine metals, you put it in a wind turbine and it keeps spinning for 20 years. If you mine coal, you burn it, you have to mine more coal, right? So the longer your wind turbine is standing, the more coal it replaces by not requiring you to keep burning stuff. So the overall total amount of mining that we will be doing because of the energy transition, actually a lot less. It goes down by roughly half. So this is one paper done by Australian Japanese team. This is another paper, same calculation, completely different data set, different scientists. I was involved with this one. And here you see the same picture, a little bit more complicated. In 2021, we mined 12.5 gigatons of stuff, which is a huge amount of stuff. And in 2040, including all the energy transition mining, will be down to 6.8, so like roughly half the amount of mining, including all of the energy transition mining. And then after 2040, you can start doing a lot less mining because then you build up the energy transition. Like there's no more transition. You build a new system, and then you can just recycle. You cannot recycle wind turbines that aren't there, but once you have all the wind turbines, you start recycling, and the more recycling you do, the less mining you need, right? So there's a bit of interplay there, but I just think it's really important to take a step back and say, okay, overall, less mining, the more energy transition you do. And then this is also what Alessandro showed, but still interesting to show one additional graph. So this is that you can see very clearly here, there's all these different countries involved in the supply chain, this electric batteries, so mining, material processing, and then you go to cell components, battery cells, and electric vehicles. And what you can see here is that at the beginning, the mining side is all over the world. Then the processing and especially the components of the battery, really a Chinese dominate supply chain. And then at the end, you have electric vehicle production, and Europe is light blue. You see, oh yeah, Europe does a little bit more there. But of course, the key thing here is that and this is what you can see happening now with the European car manufacturing, is like it floats on this entire Chinese supply chain. And this last little light blue bit isn't really viable if the entire supply chain underneath it is Chinese. And you can see already half the cars in 2020, electric cars were made in China. And that's, of course, increasing a lot. So keep this in mind, like if you look at cell components, battery cells, like, okay, 70, 80% is Chinese. And then you look at the 2024 data, it's like, ooh, that's a lot more painful. So the battery things are in the middle. That's more towards 90%, almost 100% is Chinese. So actually the situation became a lot more Chinese in the last 4 years even. And this also shows some of the other things like wind turbines, solar cells, solar modules. So you can see that this is very much Chinese dominated. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. I think later when we discuss maybe the differences between how Somo views this problem and how I view this problem, this is really key to keep in mind. Like, it's not just a lot of Chinese, it's almost exclusively Chinese, and it's becoming more and more Chinese, right? So there's less and less other countries involved. Yeah, not to leave you with, too much of a negative view on the world. What kind of solutions could we do? So what we did is we took all of these energy transition scenarios. We said, okay, we need a huge amount of materials to do the Dutch energy transition. Let's try to just not do that, right? Instead of making new mines and trying to, I don't know, make the world a better place on the other side of the world, let's look at our own country and see if we can just use less things, right? So obviously, repair is a very easy one. If your phone lasts twice as long, then you need half the amount of phone per year in order to have the same utility, more or less. Recycling is also obviously easy one, although there, of course, recycling often means downcycling and not really recycling. So there's an element there where it's actually really hard to recycle materials so that you can really make the same type of product of it. Often now recycling just means, we turn it into, I don't know, fleece sweater or something. And the second point with recycling is you cannot recycle something that's not there. So if your entire energy system is based on fossil fuels now, you cannot recycle that energy system into a wind turbine and solar panel because they're different materials. But eventually, 2040, 2050, you can start to recycle more. And then the other one is rethink. So there, of course, it's a bit contentious, but you can go really far. So I don't have a car, for instance. I just have a My Wheels abonnement. And I know from literature that for every new My Wheels car, if you put it in a village, it replaces 3 cars. And if you put it in a city like in Amsterdam or The Hague, it can replace up to 20 cars because you just use way more of it. You know, normal cars stand around 98% of the time. Electric cars, 98% of the time, you have the batteries just doing nothing. But if you have a My Wheels or whichever brand, Green Wheels, shared car, then of course the utility stays the same. I can still drive wherever I want, but you need way less car per person to achieve that utility. So on that level, you can do a lot of system redesign to just have drastically less material input per unit of both economic activity, so purely GDP, but also especially I think Alessandro also mentioned this, like stuff like mobility. You know, if you don't think about everyone should have a car, but think about everyone has the right to be mobile and to move around and go somewhere where they want to go, then you can achieve those same societal targets with way less stuff, basically. And then the last one is reduce. If you actually talk to companies, they're just very lazy when it comes to materials because they're so cheap. So yeah, we talk a lot. Interesting. We are very concerned about materials, but the materials are really cheap. And we are much more concerned now than we were a few years ago. But actually, the price of materials is way lower now than it was a few years ago. So it's very hard for companies to actually put in effort to reduce their material use. But if you ask them, quite often they can just save like 10, 20, 30% of stuff just by optimizing the design of the product. So if we do all of that, right, we look at our energy transition, we say we want to achieve the energy transition, but we want to not use all that stuff. Then, actually, this is what we came up with. So this is kind of a rough study. Interestingly, it's quite hard to get funding to actually update this study and do better studies. So Dutch government spending an insane amount of money on mining related projects and stuff, but they don't really look at this because I think it's because they think it involves changing people's behavior, and governments are very afraid of telling people to behave differently. But basically, if you look at this, the gray bar is where we started. So this big extra demand, 25%, 15%, 5%. And the green bar shows like a waterfall diagram of how that demand is reduced by all these different circularity strategies. And you can see that for most of the materials, you can almost go down to zero. And zero doesn't mean no demand, it just means no extra demand compared to 2020. Right? So a manageable demand. I mean, it's still the current energy system has its challenges, but at least you don't double the challenge. You just kind of keep it where we are now. So some tiny things that people always notice that, again, if this were a live presentation, I'll just have the audience do, but you can see that iridium goes down and platinum actually goes up. That's because they're substitutes for each other. So we replace iridium with platinum, and iridium is a really small metal, and platinum has a much larger market. So if you increase the platinum demand by the same amount as you decrease iridium, then the percentage of the global demand actually goes down a lot here and goes up a little bit there. And with the cobalt, it goes down to negative because you replace so much demand that you actually go down below the demand for cobalt in 2020. So this is very positive, I think. I was also surprised when we came up with this. Like really like, okay, actually, we're talking about all these things and we don't need to do anything. We don't need to have any dramatic wars or things or contracts or whatever. We can just go to the Netherlands and reduce the demand here, and then problem not solved, but at least for a large part solved. So this is the influence of product design and system design. So that leads to 4 recommendations. This is mostly for Netherlands, but definitely also for African countries. you do need to do some monitoring, transparency, and knowledge development. So when you say, okay, all this stuff can go down, it can go down, but you still need to do some R&D in order to actually do that, right? And to know what you're actually reducing, you need to basically know what's going on. You really need to do all these strategies at the same time. So what you also saw is you need them all. You can't just do recycling or just do behavior change. Like none of these are enough. But if you do all of them, then you can get back to zero. And I think 3 and 4 are the things that where it just falls apart in the Netherlands. Competency, on the vision and the strategy and coherency of coherent beleid. Like it's a bit of a disaster currently. And 4, better laws also goes to competency. Like sometimes there are laws and then the actual implementation in the letter of implementation is just extremely bad. So that's like, basically expertise is lacking. And the Dutch government's just not competent enough to pull this off, I would say, currently. And then finally, I'm 10 seconds over time, but a few book recommendations. The World for Sale, fantastic book on the commodity traders like Glencore. The Race for What's Left, very depressing book. And the middle one, Collapse of Complex Societies, best book ever about how these complex systems change. Bit scientific, but very interesting. That was it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for your very interesting presentation. A lot of room for thought and discussion, I think. But again, wise to sort of have 20 seconds, half minute of silence for everybody to sort of let the whole thing land. Okay. As already suggested, perhaps we have now actually 40 minutes left. We are very, very good on the time. So we have ample space for discussion. And perhaps I suggested the first step in this discussion is that Benjamin gives a reaction on the presentation of Alejandro and vice versa. Is that something that you would like to take up this glove and have a go?
Yeah, sure. So
Alejandro, is that the same for you?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
happy to have like a conversation. Yeah.
Let's give you 10, 15 minutes to.
Yeah, so I think in the interest of I think we broadly probably agree on most things, but maybe it's in the interest of debate to highlight a difference. I do think that there's still a lot of this in the way that it's being presented. A lot of like, we in the West are exploiting developing countries and we should somehow do things differently. And I think there's 2 problems here. So one, if you spend some time there, then you'll see that at least in all the places that I was, it wasn't really being exploited. It's just like very difficult situation, complete chaos. Everything was quite not optimal, so to say. And then there was a mine, but the mines were not necessarily the worst problem there. And actually often mines were a source of income and stability in some of these areas. And so there's just this like mining is only bad. I don't think that's true. It's like for a lot of countries, it's a stepping stone into doing things better. And then often it doesn't function as a stepping stone. But that's often corruption, just not things just not working properly. But quite often they don't work properly, not because of us. Like, I was involved in a couple of these projects where we try to do knowledge transfer, and move technologies to these countries, and all these projects fell apart. And they didn't fall apart because of things that the West was doing, but just like, yeah, politicians in those countries that were just like, no, we choose short-term gain, just like here, actually. Same problems that we have here. So I don't really like that framing. And the second point, I think also really important. It is true that in the past, there was, of course, a very big power imbalance between the West and Africa, etc. And like, I'm not saying anything about anything that happened, let's say, before 10, 20 years ago. But currently, as I showed in this graph with the Chinese, it's just one giant Chinese party out there. You go to these areas, everything is Chinese, all the signs are Chinese, all the people working in these mines. It's all, there's very little influence that the West in general has on this raw material supply chain. Particular European countries have even less to say. In the Netherlands, is basically completely irrelevant. And I think our concern, on the one hand, should be like, we're like really destroying our own economy pretty rapidly by not paying any attention to raw materials and basically the material basis of society. And the second, yeah, and then there's just we should really focus on our own responsibilities. Really, what I feel after studying this for a long time. That's also why I work on this topic from the Dutch perspective. What can we do here if we want to make things better in other countries? Yeah, then we can deal with them equitably and trade with them and set a project. That's always okay. But we should really focus on the Netherlands. We're doing a lot of things wrong here. We're also really bad at resources in the Netherlands. Like you look at how we dealt with Groningen, for instance. I mean, we are not able to do resource extraction in the Netherlands in a normal way. Let's first let's first develop that we are actually able to do it here, and just like reduce this extreme demand for materials and not try to fix things somewhere else if we're not, we don't have any technical capacity to add anything to these discussions. African countries shouldn't be working with us because we're not able to help these African countries to do anything useful because we don't have any technical capacity anymore. It all went to China. So yeah, I think it's about yeah, that's I think my main thing. It's like we're responsible for a lot of environmental damage, and we can fix that here in the Netherlands. And yeah, I think that's my main difference of flavor, kind of, compared to what Alessandro was saying.
You're muted, William.
Right. Alejandro, you are now on the defensive.
No, it's more a conversation. I appreciate the feedback, and I also find your presentation very interesting. I found um, uh, very interesting the part of how the environmental component has been removed from the definition of criticality, right? I think that is indeed something, and also because also what civil society and some scientists are calling is not for a material footprint, but also for an environmental footprint. So I think that's really important to look into the environmental component. Uh, because also just the word critical opens a lot of questions, right? Critical for who? Strategic for who, right? Um, and so I really, yeah, was very interesting to look into that. I don't think that it's not fair to compare like the how much barrels of oil are extracted compared to how many minerals are extracted or will be extracted. I think well, if you look into the like into how how the world has been consuming energy by energy source, every time there is a new energy source, it builds on top of the previous one. It has never reduced. Maybe only coal is an example. So if you see right now, renewables are building on top of oil and gas, and even that. Also, well, all of this mining is taking place in places that there is a very high environmental risk and biodiversity risk, and every time you need to dig deeper because the ores are not so rich. So I think that impact, and also you didn't say that, but sometimes people say, "Oh, we have enough reserves of minerals." The problem is not the reserves; it is that there is not enough investment or mining. But that ignores the fact that these reserves are located below forests, below rivers, below glaciers, and also also it ignores the fact that these minerals are not only for us, right? What about the future generations? And also that at some point recycling will be the solution. I mean, if, for example, if Indonesia will produce all of the nickel that is required in the projected demand, it will run out of nickel, and it will have in 10 or 20 years, and it will have all the environmental impacts. And then all the batteries will be in Europe to be recycled. And yeah, of course, it's very nice. Europe wants to keep those batteries and recycle them, but then Indonesia will not have nickel. So now they will need to import the old batteries from EU, right? So I think we also need to look into that. And I totally agree with your focus on mitigating strategies. I think that it's really the way to go. And also totally agree that we should be looking into our own rather than saying you in DRC need to be doing that, you in Indonesia need to be doing that. First, you need to look yourself in the mirror and see how you can reduce the environmental impact and the consumption and yeah, I do think that there is still some inequality, not only from the past, but right now still very much playing, and we see how much the inequality, the environmental impacts are, and in the consumption, and also the inequalities that are in the free trade agreements and in the WTO rules. For example, if Indonesia establishes a policy to ban the export of unprocessed nickel because it wants to support its own industry, then the EU brings a case against them in the WTO rules. But when the US protects its own industry with tariffs, there's no one can do anything about it, right? So
Okay, maybe
yeah, I leave it there.
sorry, I will have to. I'm trying to share the time.
Yeah, sure. But I think
Oh.
just to conclude, I think there is a lot of overlap, and I really agree on the mitigation strategies and that we need to focus more there.
So, but the point that your presentation paid a lot of attention to, let's say, European multinationals and not so much on the role of China. Is that part of the history of SOMO? Is it, or is it?
Sorry, no, we look into multinational corporations, and that includes also Chinese multinational corporations. I mean, we also think that the concentration of power in multinational Chinese corporations is not a good thing. Yeah, but I also don't think that blaming everything on China is also fair. I think we also need to look into the responsibility of EU and US and every country. Yeah.
So, if I may throw in a question, so both of you say something strong statements about recycling, reuse, refuse, etc., which I think are very, very valid points, interesting points. Suppose the demand of Europe would be half the present demand, or would remain at the present level. Would African countries benefit from such a position?
Well, that's a very interesting point. So indeed, no. I think a lot of these resource-rich countries are not benefiting if we reduce consumption if we don't buy from them. So actually, there's like nice research. Well, it's not nice, this is bad research, but good research, bad results, let's say, is in the DRC there were a lot of kids dying because of horrible things happening. Then there was the Dodd-Frank Act, and basically it said you're not allowed to buy from these areas. Don't support the warlords. So a lot of European companies stopped buying from there. And then the net result was that there was a lot more mortality of children in those areas. And that's logical, actually, when you think about it, because what happened was that before the warlords were fat and happy just sitting on a mine, like you could see the pictures that I showed you, they sit there with the AK-47s and like get money and party or whatever. And then there were no more mines. And then it's not like they quit. They just went around and attacked villages and started getting money in other ways. So actually the amount of violence in these areas increased a lot when Western companies stopped buying from there. So it's the complicated thing is, and also honestly as a scientist, the interesting thing is that if you interact with these areas, it's just very messy. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of violence. If as a Western company you go in that arena, you can make the lives of these people better, and you can help developing these areas. However, you cannot do that without somehow being involved in child labor, violence, etc. And what always happens is that companies that, even when they really do their best, then something happens, some kids die, some bad things happen, it gets in the media, all the NGOs get super angry, the companies get very scared, they'll pull back from these projects, and then the projects they stop, and then Chinese companies come in, and then these areas where Western companies they used to be, they removed themselves because they didn't want to be exposed to all this reputational risk, and then Chinese companies come in and they don't care about any of this, and these areas really did not benefit from this. So I think also one of the problems is, these areas they really need this development, but only if it's done in a way that it actually leads to development. And a lot of countries are getting better and better at this. So what Alejandro was saying, Indonesia is saying we don't want to export ores, we want to also have the processing. The processing, by the way, is absolutely horrific and causing extreme environmental damage. So, moderately successful from that perspective, but they did build up their own processing industry for nickel. So it's definitely possible, but there's so many corruption, and how good is the population, how competent is the local governance to deal with things. And what you see is that this is really difficult. I mean, just look at what's happening in America right now, right? Trump got elected and he's basically destroying the the federal government because they have very weak systems. And those countries, every country has in the end fairly weak system. And it's just, I think in the world of 2025, it's very hard to point at anything and then say, oh, this should be. What I'm trying to say is the whole world is very unstable and things just are what they are. And sometimes things go wrong and sometimes things go right. And I think it's really, we should just focus on improving things in the Netherlands. And
okay, well, I'm looking at the time. You have a lot to say, Benjamin, and to round off, and perhaps I see a hand raised. Perhaps we will start with that, and then afterwards we'll also go back to give Frans van der Loo the space for a question. Sandra, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your interesting presentations, both Alejandro and Benjamin. I was expecting that recycling would be an option which we can use at a lot shorter time frame than Benjamin mentioned, 2040, because this is still 15 years to go. And you would expect that there is currently, for example, a lot of cars available that are a certain moment in the end of their life cycle. So there would be sufficient mass to start recycling. So why do you say 2040 is only feasible?
Well, it's an exponential growth curve. So if you're in an exponential growth curve and you're 15, 20 years behind, then sure, there are a lot of cars to recycle, so you can fill a recycling factory with the cars. But in terms of percentage of the demand from the system being built up, that's still a tiny fraction. So yeah, the recycling increases, but it's just as a percentage of the total demand, it stays really low, because even if you're recycling, the volume that you can recycle triples, the demand actually quadruples or goes up by tenfold or something. So
Yeah.
it doesn't,
Okay.
just the numbers don't work out.
And for the,
And that's one. And the other one's actually a positive one, that electric car batteries last way longer than we expected. So we thought they'd last, I don't know, 10 years or so, but actually turns out after 10, 15 years, they're perfectly fine. So the technology works way better. So a lot of recycling companies lost a lot of money. They built factories on the basis of our projection that there'll be X amount of batteries to recycle. Turns out they're not there because they're still working. So that's, good news, but also not for recyclers.
okay, thank you.
Frans, as an organizer of this whole webinar series, I would like to give you the floor and pose some questions to the speakers.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Alexandra. Interesting presentations. Well, we deal with the webinar series Energy Transition Europe-Afrika. How can we do it in an equal partnership? And I think you leave us puzzling, because I heard some bad news and some good news for that. The bad news, I think, when we discuss raw materials and partnerships of Europe and Africa, well, we learned that most of, for instance, the battery mining and processing is done by China. So we have no position as Europe in Africa regarding the cobalt of Congo, maybe even regarding raw materials. So that's one question I have. So if we consider as a European Union to make some equal and just partnerships with Africa, can it refer to raw materials or only to other things? And then the good news, Benjamin, I think you brought it to us, because when we talked with people from Africa, also in the webinar, they say, well, you should do your homework at home, Europe, Netherlands. So go on with decreasing your raw materials and energy consumption. And what you showed about the batteries, cobalt, lithium, I got the impression we can really be circular by batteries. The cobalt and the lithium, well, we're processing it up till 80%, for the cobalt even to 200%, I got from your graph. Is that correct? And so is there a future of real circularity in the Netherlands? So maybe two questions. The European position towards Africa regarding raw materials, and the other, well, can we really be circular in the Netherlands?
I think on the first one, yeah, I mean, Europe is a giant market, so definitely on the EU level, you can do a lot. And we have a lot of companies that are really technically proficient and everything, but yeah, we just need solid industrial policy, and we need to be able to, we just need to have good engineering capacity to actually bring something to the table that is worthwhile in these countries. And then we need the people and the capital to actually go there and deploy it and do it. And you need to have the local buy-in to actually have these projects in a way that works for us. And I think there are so many places in the world where you can still mine raw materials. It's definitely possible to do it in a place where there's a win-win-win. But it does require really high quality policy making. And I think the big problem is that we see is currently Dutch government, most governments are just really incompetent, and they outsource everything to consultants. and all their thinking is just consultants writing reports, and consultants are incredibly not, the right partner in this type of thinking. They're only there to get the government to buy another report. So I think it's very, very, very in theory, everything is very possible, but in practice, currently the trends are all in the wrong direction, and it's basically based on the competence. You see, the competence, it goes wrong everywhere with the stick stuff, the nitrogen crisis, purely just incompetence on the side of the government, housing problems, this toeslagenaffaire. I mean, that's just gross negligence and incompetence. And if we're not able to fix something idiotic like toeslagenaffaire, then we're not going to be able to do something way more complex and set up a nice, equal, equitable raw material partnership in a technology that we're not really good at with other countries. So in theory, everything is possible. In practice, maybe not.
Okay. Alejandro, what is your view on this?
Yeah, well, I think that if the demand keeps growing so exponentially, then it's very difficult for recycling or for circularity to catch up, right? So first, we also need to think of reducing. And I think we shouldn't just be thinking about circularity of the battery, but thinking of the wider ecosystem. Like, how do we make smaller cars? How do we make less cars on the roads? How do we have shared all of that? I think also a barrier of recycling is that the products are not designed for recycling. And there's also all of these different technologies and different ways. So it's also very difficult to have the technology to recycle all different types of batteries, right? Like the old batteries, the lead acid batteries, it's a success story with recycling because they were uniformized. So I think that's also important to take into account, right? And on the question of if the Europe reduces its demand, if the producer countries will be happy about, I think I will say two things there. There is the first thing is that it seems that people now think that there's going to be a boom in mining and these people will flourish, these countries will flourish. This is not the first boom on mining, and these countries have not flourished. So I don't know why now people think that it will be a tremendous opportunity. I think also the issue is that many countries are export dependent. So I think that that reduction in demand needs to go hand in hand with economic diversification, right? It's not that these countries want to have their children in the mines, right? It's that they don't have any other alternative. So I think we also need to think about economic diversification and yeah. And on China, I mean, for many years, China produced 90% of the electronics, computers, smartphones, and it was not a problem. But now, with this narrative of the trade war with the batteries, it becomes a problem. But actually, Western companies are based in China, have joint ventures with China. Their biggest market is China. And so Chinese companies are also establishing in Europe. So I also think that if we really want to address the climate emergency from a environmental perspective, there needs to be collaboration rather than this antagonism between superpowers and duplication of supply chains.
For instance, the example of the Northvolt enterprise. So where was it taken its raw materials for the batteries? What did they come already from China, or were there direct sources, resources? Do you know that?
Actually, I don't know for sure, but I think they got most of it from China, probably, or at least Chinese-related supply chains.
Yeah, the thing with Northvolt is that they wanted to do everything at once, and they wanted to grow very quickly. They didn't even have one operational factory, and then they wanted to open the second one, and they wanted to do everything. their factory is mostly run by Asian staff. And there was also issues of bad management there. So
Yeah, exactly. I think Northvolt's a good example of, in China they just start 10 companies or 50 companies and they all go run and half of them go bankrupt, and then you kind of nurture the ones that do best. In Europe, we put all of our money in one company. As soon as they mess up once, then they go bankrupt, and then we all throw our hands in the air. So it's like, again, it's like a question of, it's on the one hand we didn't have the people, because like Alejandro said, most of the people working there were not European. The management was not good. They didn't understand how to make batteries. It takes decades to build that capacity, but we didn't want to take decades. We want to have it tomorrow. Yeah, so basically an example of, in the end, failed industrial policy. And industrial policy is all about boring, long-term building competency and investing in the right spots. And like not having this very, very short-term view. And I mean, this is not some kind of secret or something, but we're not doing it. And then you get things like Northvolt failing. Well, it's pretty.
So maybe more in a broad sense, going further on China and the position there. So nowadays you can speak of a competition between Europe and China and maybe Russia when it comes down to Africa. So what are the chances of Europe to keep or to get a good position towards Africa? So we kicked out at the moment, if you take France for instance. But some people say, well, there can be an advantage if Europe manages in a good way and gets for a combination, let's say not only an extractive option, but also with a real cooperation and equal partnership, also solving the problems of Africa itself, energy access, etc. So is there any opportunity for Europe to have goods to improve its position in Africa? What do you think?
But I'm just going to go back to the Northvolt's a good example. Like, if we're not able to do anything in Europe, why would we be able to do anything in Africa where the circumstances are much more difficult? I don't think. It sounds nice, but in the end, it's not going to do anything.
Alejandro?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to acknowledge that we live in this now multipolar world, right? So to our African countries, you have the US, you have the China, you have also the EU and the individual countries knocking their doors. So I think what the EU should focus on if the EU is serious about the equal partnerships, we need to address the structural barriers that are keeping African economies locked in extractive trade relationships, like rethinking the investment agreements so they really support development rather than corporate interests. We need to implement trade policies that truly promote local value addition instead of only raw material exports, and really committing to a transformative economic agenda that positions African countries as leaders, industrial and technological leaders, and not just resource suppliers, right?
Yeah, but Alejandro, is this actually true? Like, sure, this was stuff that happened in the past, but in the world of 2025, I don't think these countries are being held back by some trade agreement. Because you look at Indonesia, yeah, sure, they were sued by us, but then they just went to China, and the Chinese built all these processing plants, and now they have their processing plants. Like nobody cares about what European trade agreements want. Sure, it has an influence, but it's not the biggest thing nowadays. And then just to focus on that, like, sure, it would be nice to change it, but I don't think it would actually make a difference on the long run. Do you really think? Like, we now change the trade agreements, then suddenly it becomes better?
Well, I think it's not only about trade agreements, it's WTO rules and the infrastructure, but it's also about the partnership, right? The EU is now signing strategic partnerships with the EU countries, but and they talk about win-win situations. But what is really the win for the African country to receive European companies to do the mining and the processing there? They move from mining to processing. Why not do the economic diversification away from mining, or why not cancel the debt? Many countries are also exporting because they are trapped in debt.
Yeah, but
Why not do that? Yeah, like investing in local. Why do the recycling in Europe? Why not do the recycling in 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 Africa? So
Yeah.
I do think it's true. Yes.
I
but
think
Nico,
I'm going to stop it here.
Mm.
The nice thing about the two introductors is that you disagree about certain things, and it gives a very lively discussion. We have actually 7 more minutes left. I had hoped to stop it, but I think it's good to now give the floor to other questions. So I would start with Richard. Richard, you've been monitoring the chats. Are there some good questions that you think, yeah, these are good? And at the same time, everybody who wants to raise a hand and give a question, please feel free.
Like comment.
Yes, thank you, Willem. A few questions from the chat. One is from Gerdien, and I think it's for Alejandro. Does your message reach companies and politicians? We've heard from Benjamin that the Dutch government is incompetent, but perhaps there are other politicians or companies that are more forward-looking and sensitive to ecological and economic injustices. And then perhaps the question for Benjamin as well. This was about new battery developments. We see now already that nickel and cobalt are being replaced in batteries by phosphate. This can be seen as a form of substitution. But of course, phosphate is a critical mineral as well. It's vital for food production. It's used in fertilizers that perhaps in the Netherlands we can do without if we make our agricultural system more circular. But that's not the case everywhere, especially not in Africa, in places with poor soils. So this substitution towards LFP, phosphate batteries, does it risk increasing hunger in the world? And then this was a question by Wim de Jong. There's also a possibility that we might be able to replace lithium in batteries by natrium. What consequences would that have? It's also a question, I think, for Benjamin. This is it.
Okay, Alejandro, the question to you. Do you reach? Yeah.
Okay, I try to be brief. Yeah. So if it reach companies and policymakers, well, of course, part of the message is very difficult to reach to companies because what we are saying, and not we some, but also scientists and civil society academics, is that using natural resources to bring increased growth and looking into profit maximization and increasing shareholder value, that's at the core of the problem. So, and companies usually tend to focus on profit maximization. So it's indeed hard there. So we need some external force to push to change the business model. Maybe on the part of circularity and efficiency, then there is more pickup by some companies. And with policymakers, well, it depends, right? The political spectrum, and as you all know, is changing. And right now, it's very hard, this competitiveness talk and priority. But I think that we fail to make a connection between actually competitiveness is also looking for alternatives and looking for, instead of trying to make batteries, why don't we focus on substitution or on new technologies or on new ways of delivering the the well-being for society. So yeah, challenging. But yeah, there are of course some politicians and some companies that are more open to this sort of discussions.
Are companies scared of SOMO?
Well, maybe a little bit, not as much as we would like to.
Not enough for sure. Okay, well, regarding phosphates increasing hunger, I've never heard that. I don't actually, so to be honest, I don't know. So I have no idea, but if I would think, then maybe, so three options. Either we just never bothered to calculate it and it does increase hunger, but we just didn't know. Two is it's a different type of chemical. So sure, it has the same element, but it still comes from a very different mineral. So they might not interact. That's what I think is true. And the third one is probably the volumes are way smaller because like a lot of phosphates go into the food industry. And then if you divert a tiny bit into batteries, like it takes a lot of mental space, but in actual volume, people aren't very good at order of magnitude thinking, right? So then I don't think it's a problem. But and the second one, substitution of technology, yeah, that's a very, I mean, it's one of the most interesting things happening now. It's like this incredibly fast substitution in the Chinese market from different technology types. Yeah, it's a bit of a wild card. It makes it really hard to predict long term what really we need in terms of materials. So you can see now the cobalt price is very low, and all the companies that were investing in cobalt are basically either bankrupt or losing lots of money because everyone thought we need a lot of cobalt, and then poof, the Chinese were just came out with a new technology that doesn't use any cobalt. And now actually they're using cobalt more, not because, yeah, just because the price is so low, it's the cheapest option. So you get this back and forth substitution. So to answer the question, it has extremely strong influence on the situation because, as Alejandro showed, most of the material requirement goes into car batteries and not into wind turbines or solar panels. And then most of the critical raw materials go into the engine and into the battery. And the battery is by far the biggest. So if you make a change there in technology, massive implications for the supply chains. It's really a wild card because you can use so many different elements. You can use a potato to make a battery, right? It's really, there are so many combinations that you can turn into batteries. And then it's kind of hard. It's not hard to predict. It's literally impossible to really predict long term what's going to happen. But then I think it goes back to what I was saying before. You need to have really competent R&D and technology and engineers to be able to kind of play ball. And this is one of the reasons why Northvolt went bankrupt. They gambled on one technology and then they couldn't change when the next one came. And CATL, the big Chinese companies, they're super good at what they're doing. So they just make all the technologies. They don't care. They just go from A to B to C. And in the Netherlands, we just, cut €1 billion from our universities. So yeah, in the end, it comes down to, it's a very dynamic world, and in order to survive in a very dynamic world, you have to be very good, and that's I think the main message.
Or perhaps just choose one battery as Europe and say we stick to this battery, and all the European car manufacturers build on it.
Yeah, very interesting. I really wish that we could get our act together and that you just pick one, because in the end, yeah, it's true. If you just pick one and then the other is like 5% less efficient than this one, but going for 5% more efficiency means you lose half of your economic activity in your continent. Yeah, 100%. you should go for the less efficient and just force that. Yeah, no, but then still you need to have the engineers to be able to do it if you need to hire everyone from China to build a factory. But yeah, I agree. That would be great, but it again requires point 3 on my presentation, long-term strategy and policy making.
You're mute again.
We are running out of time, and we are losing audience as a consequence. Thank you very much, Benjamin and Alejandro, for your very interesting presentations. It would have been my role to, with 3 sentences, take the most concrete points and of everything that has been said here. I'm not capable of that. We will be writing a report, and then we'll be weighing everything that has been said. And I think as a team, we will suggest some conclusions and also share these with you, Alejandro, and Benjamin, and of course the audience via the site of GroenLinks PvdA. So with this, I think is the point to conclude and say goodbye. Oh yeah, Frans, I see a finger from Frans.
So there will be some next webinars, but the date are not yet fixed. So there is somewhere in the program March 12, but that will not run. And we will inform you as soon as possible about the next webinars. So you will find something about that in your postbox as soon as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so if you would have been live, we would have given you a bottle of wine, but in this virtual setting, I don't know what has been developed as the alternative. So everybody, thank you for your attention, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You guys want to stay for a minute or two?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Once all the audience is gone.
Nou, degene die geluisterd hebben, Titia en Richard, misschien jullie feedback.
Well, maybe in English.
Yeah, sure.
I see Alejandro is still there.
Perhaps to the speakers, how did you think it was going? Worthwhile? Do you think you have changed people's minds?
No. I think for me, my story was too, I wouldn't say nihilistic, but maybe it does convince people that we should do more in the Netherlands. So.
Yeah.
I will be curious to know more about who was in the room. I don't know if you have a registration list, and also if you ask
can you say something about that?
Yeah.
Titia, can you say something about that?
Sorry. What about?
Well, who was attending?
Attending, well, 40 on the maximum, and now it is 6.
But who are they?
I don't know. Some people have only a forename and not a whole name, so I can't say it.
But it will be the members of GroenLinks and PvdA.
Yes. Most of them are good. Yeah.
I think they're
we have 200,
200
mostly 300 people who will want to follow it, but each webinar has 40, 60 participants. But the reports came to 300.
Yeah.
So my question was if it's students or general public or are politicians or But I don't know if you asked that in the registration. Maybe you don't ask.
I think there are some from also the renewable sector. I think there are some from NGO, developmental NGOs. For instance, it's also many people, I think, from there are some environmental groups in PvdA and GroenLinks as well.
Yeah, the most of them.
Yeah.
And I think that many of those are old men, pensioned old men.
Nice.
Many.
Like myself.
Some are active in local politics as well.
Yeah.
I still have a question for Benjamin.
Benjamin,
you're very pessimistic about the Dutch government.
Yeah.
How are you also so pessimistic about the European Union, the Commission?
No, less pessimistic. Are you pessimistic about the Dutch government?
Yes.
It's just, geez, it's like one disaster after the other.
Yeah. But of course, it's a long-term thing. I mean, this deregulation and this deindustrialization was a sort of ideology. It was Rutte, before. And I think the French would be the country that tried to have still a state industrial policy in the last 2 decades. So,
well, so maybe one thing for GroenLinks Partij voor Arbeid, one thing. So I'm part of the Partij voor de Dieren. Yeah, it does kind of bother me how they just keep going to Tata Steel and just like protest. Like, it's not very productive, you know? Like, I think on the left side, I would also say I'm on the left side of the political spectrum, but there isn't a really realistic. I think Richard's doing a great job, but there isn't a good enough clear vision of what a Dutch industrial policy looks like. And that leads to the VVD being the main. If I look at the politics, the main politician that actually says stuff about my topic is Silvio Erkens, and he always says the same dumb shit, like, "Oh, I need to have more nuclear power plants." But then he's the only one that actually responds to the things that are happening. Like, oh, another company dies, then it's Silvio Erkens asking the difficult questions, and then of course his answer is always the same. But I'm always a bit disappointed that we don't. I'm saying we as a scientist, I'm not part of left, but as a person, I'm part of. We don't have a good, person saying, "Oh no, there's another year of 5 billion losses at Tata Steel. What do we do to fix this?" Like you can't just only say this is also. It's not just Rutte. It's also the consequence of on the left side just don't wanting to engage with industry at all, not wanting to engage at all, and then you kind of create this. And then this is where we are. There's nothing left, and it's really damaging. So I think it's also if you look at sure, I agree. Rutte is by far the biggest problem, the Rutte regime. But if you look at Circle van Invloed, I also think there's a lot that we could do ourselves.
Would you want to keep Tata in the Netherlands, Benjamin?
Yeah, I would. Okay. And stuff. I mean, I'm not saying it should be Tata Steel currently owned by the Indians or Nearstar owned by Trafigura, but I'm definitely saying we should have a big ass steel plant somewhere, and we should have a zinc refiner. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you could also say we put it in Belgium, but I think much further away than that is like a bad idea.
Yeah. I think GroenLinks PvdA is having a lot of contact with Tata. And those who want to green Tata on the basis that it has a future in the Netherlands.
Yeah, it should, and in general, the heavy industry. It's hard to have heavy industry here. And of course, I understand they do a lot of lying about things all the time. But then you go back to if you want to talk to Tata, I'm very capable of going to Tata and talking to them because I know all their stuff. I know all the thermodynamics. They like talking to me. I also disagree with them quite often. That's totally fine. But you do need to have people in your party that have all the technical know-how and knowledge, and I still don't like what they're doing. It's a very different discussion than if you just stand there and protest against some gray dust that you don't actually know what it is and why it's there. So I think I think that's our own. But what do you? What do you think, Hans? What is your impression?
Frans.
Yeah, you're the.
So,
Yeah.
no, sorry, I was preparing a different question. So not to go into this discussion.
No, not
But,
this particular, but in general of the whole
Yeah.
today session.
Well, it should be informed decision making, but it's the balance between politics and the academic field.
Yeah, of course.
Sometimes the academic field is too little politics oriented, and the other way around. Yeah.
No, but I think there should be something there also.
Yeah.
I like your suggestion, because I think as soon as GroenLinks would engage with industry about the future, it would create a strange, let's say, coalition that could actually achieve something.
Yeah.
I need
hope
to
so.
go. Sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe I can add it from this angle. So what I experience, I'm also one from the renewable energy sector, and when I ask people there, okay, well, we discuss now about raw materials in Africa and colonialism, etc. So that's also part of the energy transition here. People are saying, okay, could be, but we have no attention for that. We're too busy, etc. So there's no linkage between the renewable energy sector and the more global south oriented sector, because there's also many NGOs focusing on Africa and the global south, but there's no connection between the energy transition sector here and what we discuss this afternoon, for instance.
Yeah. Well, okay. I guess if there's nothing else.
One thing.
You were still wanting to react, I think, or not?
Who?
I thought that you was wanting to give a reaction to the.
No, I just wanted to say that I need to go and that.
Okay.
Thank you. No, but I mean, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
I hope you well, and I will get a better speaker next time.
And we keep in touch. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Benjamin,
Yeah.
are you still there?
Yeah.
Just one thing about the phosphate and the batteries. I think this issue was raised a couple of years ago by Dana Cordell, famous researcher who predicted peak phosphorus. And there's little information I can find on it, except for that the IEA in 2023 said if all batteries today were LFP, that's just that conflicting demands for phosphorus may arise in the future as battery demand increases.
Okay, so could something maybe.
Yeah.
It's another problem to think about.
Need to calculate.
Oké, jongens.
Ja, je wilt stoppen? Oké, let's stop. Nou,
Bye.
Bye.
Dag.